July 18, 1943, southern Russia, near the Belgorod-Kharkov road. The air is thick with dust and cordite. Engines idle not from discipline, but from fear of burning the last drops of fuel. Steel hulks, Panthers, Panzer IVs, sit angled in shallow earth, their crews listening more than looking. The sun is already high. It has been high for days. German tank commanders scan the horizon through scorched optics. The radio crackles, then goes silent. Somewhere to the east, Soviet artillery begins its slow, deliberate calibration, one ranging shot, then another. The sound rolls across the steppe like distant thunder. Maps no longer match the ground. Orders no longer match reality. What was once an elite armored spearhead, trained, equipped, confident, is now compressed into a shrinking pocket of land. Ammunition is counted shell by shell. Fuel is measured in minutes. Recovery vehicles are gone. Infantry support has thinned into shadows. This is not a retreat. It is not even a battle. It is a calculation unfolding in real time. Within the next 96 hours, one of Germany's most prestigious panzer formations will cease to exist as a fighting force, not through a single catastrophic blow, but through pressure, precision, and inevitability. And as the Soviet guns fall silent for a moment, the men inside the steel wait, knowing the pause will not last. Because to understand how this moment became unavoidable, we must step back to the decisions that made it inevitable. By the summer of 1943, Germany was no longer fighting to win the war. It was fighting to regain control of time. The catastrophe at Stalingrad, sealed in February, had shattered the illusion of invincibility that once surrounded the Wehrmacht. Entire armies had vanished into Soviet captivity. The Eastern Front had not merely shifted west, it had become unstable, volatile, and unforgiving. For the first time since 1941, Germany's strategic initiative was no longer assured. Yet in Berlin, defeat was not acknowledged. It was deferred. Adolf Hitler and the OKW believed that one decisive blow could still reset the war. That blow was to be delivered at Kursk, a vast Soviet salient that bulged westward between Orel and Belgorod. If severed, it promised encirclement, prestige, and perhaps most critically, psychological recovery. Operation Citadel was conceived not as a campaign, but as a statement. To execute it, Germany assembled what it still believed to be its greatest strength, armored shock power. Panzer divisions were rebuilt, refitted, and reinforced. New weapons were rushed into service, some unfinished, some untested, because time no longer allowed for patience. Among these formations stood one unit with symbolic weight far beyond its numbers, Panzer Grenadier Division, Grossdeutschland. Grossdeutschland was not just another division, it was the Reich's showcase formation. Recruited from across Germany, lavishly equipped, and frequently reinforced, it had fought in Poland, France, and the opening phases of Barbarossa. Its reputation was carefully cultivated. When Grossdeutschland advanced, it was meant to be seen. By July 1943, the division had been upgraded to a powerful combined arms force with a strong armored component. It was issued Panther tanks, still plagued by mechanical failures but possessing unmatched firepower on paper. Veterans filled its ranks. Confidence, though scarred by Stalingrad, still existed. But the battlefield had changed. The Red Army that waited at Kursk was not the force of 1941. It was deeper, layered, rehearsed. Soviet commanders had months to prepare. Trenches were dug in kilometers, not meters. Minefields were planted not in patches, but in belts. Artillery was pre-registered down to the grid square. And perhaps most importantly, Soviet intelligence knew Citadel was coming. As German armor assembled, Soviet factories ran day and night. Tanks were replaced faster than Germany could destroy them. Crews were trained to fight defensively, then counterattack en masse. The goal was not to stop the Germans at the frontier, but to absorb them, bleed them, and then close the trap. Still, on 5 July 1943, German forces attacked. The opening days of Citadel were brutal but inconclusive. German units advanced under heavy losses, slowed by mines, artillery, and mechanical failures. Panthers broke down almost as often as they fired. Tigers proved powerful but few. Infantry struggled to keep pace under constant Soviet fire. By mid-July, it was clear the breakthrough was failing. Then came the turning point. On 12 July, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov in the north and prepared Operation Rumyantsev in the south. German attention was split, reserves were thin, and while Hitler hesitated, the Red Army moved. For divisions like Grossdeutschland, still forward deployed near Belgorod, the situation changed rapidly. What had been an offensive posture became exposed flanks. What had been a spearhead became a liability. The initiative was slipping, hour by hour. And as German units attempted to regroup, the Soviet counterstroke began forming around them, tightening its geometry with methodical precision. To understand why this collapse was not accidental, but structural, we must examine the deeper conditions that made escape increasingly impossible. The failure of Operation Citadel was not sudden. It was cumulative. By the third week of July 1943, German armored formations on the southern face of the Kursk salient were exhausted in ways that reports could not fully capture. Losses were not only counted in destroyed tanks, but in worn engines, broken transmissions, and crews pushed past the limits of endurance. The battlefield had become a machine that consumed precision faster than Germany could replace it. For Grossdeutschland, the problem was compounded by position. The division sat near the Belgorod-Kharkov axis, an operational crossroads of roads, rail lines, and open steppe. It was a position of opportunity during an advance, but a liability once the initiative was lost. Soviet planners understood this. Their counteroffensive, Operation Rumyantsev, was designed not merely to push German units back, but to cut them apart. Soviet strategy had matured. Rather than pursuing deep breakthroughs immediately, Red Army commanders applied layered pressure, artillery saturation, infantry probes, then armored exploitation. German formations were forced to react instead of dictate. Each reaction cost fuel. Each maneuver consumed time. And time was the one resource Germany no longer had. German command culture made adaptation slower. Orders flowed downward in rigid form. Initiative existed at the tactical level, but operational flexibility was constrained by political interference. Hitler demanded ground be held, even when it no longer served a purpose. Withdrawals required approval. Approval took time. Soviet shells did not. Meanwhile, logistics frayed. Fuel shortages plagued panzer units across the front, but elite formations like Grossdeutschland felt the contradiction most sharply. They possessed powerful machines, but lacked the means to move them freely. Supply columns were targeted by Soviet aircraft. Railheads were under constant attack. Even when fuel arrived, it often did so too late. Mechanical failure became a quiet killer. Panther tanks, introduced in large numbers for Citadel, suffered from engine fires, final drive failures, and overheating. Crews were trained under compressed schedules. Spare parts were scarce. Recovery vehicles could not operate under constant artillery threat. A broken tank was often a lost tank. As the Soviets advanced southward from Urel and northward from the Donetsk basin, the geometry of the battlefield began to tighten. German formations found themselves defending multiple directions simultaneously. Flanks dissolved into gaps. Communications fractured. Maps became outdated within hours. By 18 July, Grossdeutschland was no longer positioned for attack. It was attempting to stabilize a front that no longer existed. Soviet reconnaissance units pressed forward relentlessly, identifying weak points, isolating battalions, and marking targets for artillery. Air superiority, once contested, increasingly favored the Red Air Force. German columns moved at night, when they moved at all. The concept of a clean withdrawal vanished. What replaced it was a series of desperate local decisions: hold this ridge, abandon that village, burn disabled vehicles, pull crews back on foot. Each decision narrowed the options further. Each hour reduced the margin for survival. German after-action reports would later describe these days with clinical language: fluid situation, enemy pressure, temporary loss of contact. But between the lines lay a harsher truth. The division was being shaped into a pocket. Not by accident, not by surprise, but by a Soviet operational design that treated time, space, and firepower as weapons. And once that pocket fully formed, the coming 96 hours would not be about maneuver or doctrine, but about endurance, cohesion, and whether elite status could still matter when escape routes disappeared. At that point, the battle ceased to be purely military and became deeply human. Inside a Panzer, the war was not grand strategy. It was heat, vibration, and waiting. Crews of Grossdeutschland had been fighting almost continuously since the opening of Citadel. Sleep came in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 there, often interrupted by artillery or orders to reposition. The interior of a tank in July was an oven, sweat-soaked uniforms, hands slipped on metal controls, exhaust fumes clung to lungs. These men were not inexperienced. Many were veterans of France and the early Eastern Front. They knew what danger sounded like. They could identify artillery calibers by ear. They could judge distance by the time between flash and impact. What they had never experienced was suffocation by inevitability. Letters found later spoke of confusion more than fear. "We do not know where the front is," one crewman wrote. Another mentioned burning a perfectly functional tank because no fuel remained to move it. Elite training did not prepare them for that choice. Morale eroded quietly. Not through panic, but through the slow realization that skill could not overcome mathematics. Soviet forces had more guns, more fuel, and more men, and they were using all three without pause. Angle 2, tactical compression and firepower. Tactically, the battlefield became smaller by the hour. Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized constant pressure. Batteries rotated fire missions, ensuring no sector remained quiet long enough for German units to reorganize. When tanks attempted to move, artillery followed. When infantry dug in, rockets arrived. German defensive doctrine relied on counterattacks to restore balance, but counterattacks required fuel, coordination, and freedom of maneuver. All three were vanishing. Instead of maneuver warfare, Grossdeutschland was forced into static defense, something German armor was never designed to sustain under heavy artillery dominance. Tanks became pillboxes. Mobility, their greatest strength, was neutralized. Each kilometer lost reduced options. Each option lost increased exposure. Angle 3, technology under stress. On paper, Grossdeutschland's tanks were formidable. Panthers carried long-barreled 75 mm guns capable of destroying any Soviet tank at range. Tigers dominated frontal engagements. But technology, under ideal conditions, rarely survives reality. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, optics clouded with dust. Soviet anti-tank teams learned quickly to aim for tracks, immobilizing even the most powerful vehicles. Once stopped, a tank became a target rather than a weapon. By the time the pocket began to fully close, operational readiness had dropped sharply, not because of combat losses alone, but because machines had reached their limits. Elite equipment did not mean indestructible equipment. And as night fell over the steppe, the glow of burning vehicles marked positions more clearly than maps ever could, signaling to Soviet gunners exactly where pressure should be applied next. But beyond the men and machines, larger forces were shaping the outcome, forces rooted in leadership decisions and enemy adaptation. Command within Grossdeutschland was experienced, disciplined, and by 1943, deeply constrained. At the regimental and battalion level, officers understood the danger unfolding around them. Reconnaissance reports were clear. Soviet pressure was not random, it was coordinated and expanding. Requests to pull back to more defensible positions were sent upward repeatedly. But authority, no longer flowed cleanly. Operational decisions were increasingly centralized. Hitler's insistence on holding ground limited flexibility. Withdrawals required justification, approval, and timing, three things incompatible with a battlefield evolving by the hour. Even when permission was granted, the situation had often already changed. This disconnect between frontline reality and higher command produced hesitation. Units waited when they should have moved. Movement, when finally ordered, occurred under fire. The cost multiplied. Leadership failure here was not incompetence, it was paralysis by structure. Angle 5. The Soviet operational mindset. Opposing Grossdeutschland was a Red Army that had learned from catastrophe. Soviet commanders no longer sought immediate annihilation through reckless assaults. Instead, they applied pressure across a wide front, forcing German units to commit reserves piecemeal. Once reserves were identified, artillery and armor concentrated against them. Encirclement was achieved not through speed alone, but through endurance. Soviet tank armies exploited breakthroughs only after German mobility collapsed. Infantry sealed gaps. Engineers repaired roads and bridges under fire. Supply followed quickly behind, allowing momentum to be sustained. The goal was not heroism. It was control. By maintaining constant contact, Soviet forces denied Grossdeutschland the breathing room needed to reorganize or withdraw coherently. Angle 6. Moral weight and psychological fracture. Elite status carried an invisible burden. Men of Grossdeutschland had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that they were among the best. That reputation fostered pride, cohesion, and confidence, but under encirclement, it also bred disbelief. If this division could be trapped, what could not? As fuel ran out and orders grew contradictory, cracks appeared, not in discipline, but in belief. Crews began planning for abandonment even before orders arrived. Equipment was sabotaged to prevent capture. Maps were burned. The realization set in quietly. Survival would be individual before it could be collective. By the end of the third day, Grossdeutschland was no longer thinking in terms of objectives or lines. It was thinking in terms of exits, real or imagined. And it was at that moment, when cohesion began to thin, that the Soviet forces tightened their grip, transforming pressure into decision. What followed was not a gradual decline, but a decisive turn, measured in hours, not days. July 19, 1943, early morning. The Soviet guns resume before dawn. There is no preparatory pause this time, no probing fire, no warning. Artillery strikes land across known German assembly areas with mathematical precision, roads, tree lines, reverse slopes already mapped by reconnaissance and aerial observation. The bombardment is not meant to destroy everything. It is meant to freeze movement. For Grossdeutschland, this is the moment when uncertainty hardens into fact. Radio traffic spikes, then fragments. Units report enemy armor appearing on their flanks, first in small groups, then in columns. Soviet T-34s do not rush forward blindly. They advance behind rolling artillery curtains, halting when resistance stiffens, then shifting pressure elsewhere. German counterfire is accurate but insufficient. Ammunition stocks are uneven. Some crews still have armor-piercing rounds but lack high explosive. Others have shells but no fuel to reposition. Recovery vehicles are absent. Damaged tanks are either fought in place or destroyed by their own crews. By mid-morning, German reconnaissance confirms what officers already suspect. Escape routes are closing. Villages that had served as waypoints days earlier are now Soviet strongpoints. Bridges are gone or under fire. The road south toward Kharkov is intermittently cut by artillery and air attack. Attempts to mass for a breakout draw immediate response. The battlefield contracts. Soviet infantry infiltrates forward positions, forcing German units to defend in multiple directions simultaneously. Anti-tank teams move through tall grass and shell craters, guided by sound and smoke. A single hit to a track immobilizes a Panther. Within minutes, artillery finishes the job. Commanders face impossible choices. Hold ground and risk encirclement. Move and risk annihilation on open roads. By the afternoon of July 19, Großdeutschland's Armored Corps is no longer operating as a division. It is a collection of isolated Kampfgruppen, each fighting its own war, each unaware of how close the collapse truly is. As night falls, fires burn across the steppe. The glow reveals positions no longer meant to be hidden. Soviet forces do not rush. They wait. They tighten the ring. They allow exhaustion to do its work. The 96-hour nightmare has passed its midpoint. And with dawn approaching, the final calculations of fuel, distance, and survival are about to be made. July 20, 1943, before sunrise. The breakout attempt begins in darkness. German commanders choose the only remaining corridor that appears weakly held, a narrow stretch of open ground punctuated by shallow ravines and hedgerows. It is not an ideal route. It is simply the last one not fully sealed. Orders are brief. Units are told to move fast, stay dispersed, and abandon vehicles that cannot keep pace. Engines start quietly, some for the final time. The first movement draws immediate response. Soviet artillery, already registered on the approach routes, opens fire within minutes. Flares rise, turning night into a harsh white glow. Shadows stretch across the ground. Columns scatter instinctively, breaking cohesion even before contact. Panzer crews push forward anyway. Some tanks reach the first ravine and descend under cover of smoke. Others are hit on the open ground, erupting into flame that lights the path behind them. Infantry follow on foot, weaving through shell craters, dragging wounded, discarding equipment. The corridor collapses faster than it formed. Soviet armor arrives from the flanks, not charging, but cutting, severing links between units, isolating groups, forcing them to choose between surrender, destruction, or dispersal. Air attacks follow with brutal timing. Bombs strike roads already churned by tracks and explosions, blocking movement entirely. By mid-morning, the breakout is no longer an operation. It is an escape. Small groups slip through gaps created by chaos rather than design. Others are trapped and destroyed in place. Disabled tanks are blown up by their crews, turrets blackened, hulls split, their silhouettes frozen where momentum died. German radio traffic fades to silence. By the afternoon of July 20, Soviet reports record large numbers of prisoners, abandoned equipment, and burning armor across the sector. Großdeutschland, as a coherent armored force, no longer exists. What remains retreats in fragments, on foot, in trucks without markings, in borrowed vehicles, toward positions that no longer resemble a front line. The battlefield quiets not because the fight is over, but because the result is settled. Within 96 hours, Germany's elite panzer formation has been stripped of its power, not by a single catastrophic strike, but by methodical pressure that allowed no recovery. And as the smoke lifts, the consequences extend far beyond the wreckage scattered across the steppe. Because the destruction of Großdeutschland was not merely a tactical defeat, it reshaped the balance of the Eastern Front. The battlefield of Belgorod, Kharkov after July 20, 1943, was a landscape of burned steel, cratered earth, and silence heavy with absence. What had once been the Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland, a symbol of German armored pride, was now a fractured shadow of itself. Casualty figures are difficult to reconcile fully, but post-war German and Soviet records converge on the scale of devastation. Tanks and armored vehicles. Estimates suggest 40–50% of Großdeutschland's armored strength was destroyed, abandoned, or captured within these 4 days. Personnel casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, numbered several thousand, decimating both veteran leadership and experienced crews. Equipment loss beyond armor, artillery, trucks, and logistical assets was similarly impaired, creating a secondary crisis in mobility and resupply. For the German High Command, the implications were immediate. Reports filtered back to the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, describing encirclement, retreat, and equipment loss. The language in these reports, clinical and detached, masked the operational shock. An elite division, meticulously trained and well-equipped, had been effectively neutralized within 4 days. The realization was stark. Even the best formations could not overcome systemic failures in logistics, command flexibility, and battlefield intelligence. Soviet accounts, preserved in operational journals and later verified through archival studies, emphasized the methodical precision of the counteroffensive. Rather than a single decisive strike, success was achieved through continuous artillery pressure that immobilized German armor, coordinated infantry probes to identify and exploit weak points, the use of air reconnaissance to monitor German movements, exploitation of mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and isolated units. The result was more than tactical victory. It was the demonstration of an evolved Soviet operational art, absorbing German attacks, creating controlled attrition, and executing encirclements with patience and precision. Among survivors of Grossdeutschland, the human toll was evident. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews speak of a sense of disbelief, not just at the scale of destruction, but at the speed with which an elite unit could be reduced to fragments. Morale, cohesion, and trust in command were shaken irreversibly. Some survivors would later describe these days as hours in which every decision felt wrong and every path led to loss. But the consequences extended beyond the division itself. The collapse of an elite Panzer formation had broader operational ramifications. German armored reserves in the southern sector were forced into defensive postures. Soviet forces gained momentum, enabling subsequent offensives toward Kharkov with less resistance. The psychological impact of witnessing an invincible unit destroyed reverberated across German formations, undermining confidence in armored doctrine and strategic planning. By the evening of July 20, the battlefield was largely quiet. Fires smoldered where tanks had burned. Cratered roads blocked movement. Survivors regrouped haphazardly, many without vehicles or coherent command structures. The division's cohesive fighting capability had effectively ceased. Yet this was only the first layer of aftermath. Beyond immediate losses, the strategic and psychological consequences of this destruction would echo through German operations for months, shaping both doctrine and morale. The destruction of Grossdeutschland reverberated far beyond the steppe around Belgorod and Kharkov. Operationally, it signaled a shift in the balance of armored power on the Eastern Front. Where German units had once dictated tempo, they were now reacting to Soviet initiative. The loss of an elite division, one that had been considered a spearhead for counteroffensives, forced neighboring corps to adopt defensive postures, stretching already thin lines and reducing strategic options for high command. German reports stressed that the collapse was sudden, but analysts later concluded it was the predictable result of systemic weaknesses, overextended supply lines, rigid command structures, mechanical failures, and underestimation of Soviet resilience. The failure of Grossdeutschland exemplified the risks of over-reliance on technology and elite training when broader operational conditions, terrain, logistics, enemy preparedness, were unfavorable. Soviet forces capitalized immediately. By July 22, remnants of the division were pushed further west. Strategic towns and crossroads that had been contested became accessible to advancing Soviet armored and infantry units. The counteroffensive, meticulously planned, had not only neutralized elite German armor, but created opportunities for further exploitation, opening corridors for armored thrusts toward Kharkov and reinforcing the northern and southern flanks of the salient. Psychologically, the impact was profound. German soldiers on other fronts observed reports of the annihilation with disbelief. If the best trained, best equipped division could be neutralized in 96 hours, what hope remained for the average unit under sustained Soviet pressure? Commanders faced questions not just of logistics and tactics, but of morale and trust. Letters from officers to the OKH reflect frustration and resignation, as even capable leadership could not prevent disintegration under encirclement. Soviet reports, conversely, celebrated the outcome as a model of operational patience. They documented lessons for future campaigns, use attrition combined with localized encirclements, exploit enemy mechanical weaknesses, and apply pressure to erode cohesion rather than rely solely on frontal assaults. The engagement reinforced confidence in the Red Army's evolving doctrines of deep operations and operational art, laying the groundwork for continued offensives across Ukraine. For Grossdeutschland itself, rebuilding would be slow. The division was reconstituted with new recruits, vehicles, and equipment, but the experience of annihilation left lasting scars. Veterans carried the memory of rapid collapse, the weight of lost comrades, and the knowledge that no reputation, however prestigious, could guarantee survival against methodical, well-prepared opposition. This psychological imprint influenced subsequent training, deployment strategies, and leadership decisions throughout the remainder of the war. The battlefield was cleared, the smoke lifted, and yet the consequences lingered. A cautionary example of how elite units can be undone not by heroism, but by the interplay of preparation, pressure, and inevitability. From the ruins of this 96-hour ordeal, we turn to reflection, what this event meant for the broader history of warfare, armored operations, and human endurance under extreme conditions. Destruction of Grossdeutschland over 4 relentless days stands as a stark testament to the limits of training, technology, and reputation when confronted with strategy, patience, and preparation. Elite status could not shield the men inside their tanks from the slow, inescapable grip of encirclement. Machinery could not compensate for logistical failure or overextended lines. Leadership, however disciplined, could not reverse decisions made too late or orders misaligned with battlefield realities. In the broader scope of World War II, these 96 hours illustrate a profound shift. The Eastern Front was no longer a stage for rapid German maneuvers or tactical brilliance alone. It had become a theater where operational art, resilience, and depth of preparation dictated outcomes. Soviet forces demonstrated that patience, methodical planning, and the disciplined application of pressure could overcome even the most feared units. The fall of an elite Panzer division was both symbolic and practical, a signal that the balance of armored power had begun to tip irreversibly. For the soldiers of Grossdeutschland, the ordeal left more than material loss. It reshaped their understanding of combat and survival. The smoke, the explosions, the uncertainty of each decision all became enduring memories of a battle where human endurance was tested as harshly as steel and firepower. Letters, diaries, and post-war recollections preserve not heroics alone, but a nuanced truth that war is often decided by patience, preparation, and circumstance, rather than the valor of the individual. Ultimately, the 96-hour nightmare is a lesson in humility. It underscores that no force, however elite, operates in isolation. Strategy, logistics, timing, and adaptability can outweigh firepower. History remembers Grossdeutschland not simply as a division that fell, but as a mirror reflecting the evolution of warfare on the Eastern Front, a moment when human ingenuity, operational discipline, and sheer endurance collided in a way that changed the trajectory of armored combat. And in the quiet aftermath, when smoke cleared and the battlefield lay strewn with shattered steel, the world understood that war is as much about the calculated measures that surround the fight as the fighting itself.